No, Daniel got a lot uglier. I said Daniel got a lot uglier. I'm not as good looking as Daniel is. Yeah. All right, let's get started, please. Let's get started. I've said it once, I've said it before, I'll say it many, 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 many times. One of the things I'm looking forward to up in heaven is time does not matter. If I want to stand around and talk to somebody for 100 years, it's still day one. And I will never be late ever again. So my kids will never complain, Dad, let's go, because I'm always standing around talking. No. Welcome to our Sunday morning adult Bible class here at Surprise Church of Christ. Obviously, I'm not the regular teacher. Daniel was involved with our fall festival yesterday and went home with a slight fever. He doesn't think he's sick. He thinks he just has too many logs in the fire and then stood too close to it. So probably just a little bit of exhaustion. So luckily I feel like that we're blessed to serve in a congregation, to worship in a congregation where we can give Daniel a break. Daniel does an excellent job, and I don't want to ever be at a point where we take that for granted. So I'm glad that we're able to give him a week off. So I will be doing the adult Bible class this morning. In case you don't know, my name is John Batty. I'm one of the elders here, and I happen to know my mom hasn't showed up yet, so you can tell her that she missed out on like an excellent Bible class. Make her jealous. She may still show up here, and then Dave will do the preaching this morning. So we're glad that we're able to give Daniel the time off. Do we pass around the microphone or no? But I want to see Roger, so, okay. Okay. If we could have somebody open us up with a prayer. Probably the guy holding the microphone. All right, there we go.
Yeah. Dear loving Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day and all the blessings it brings us. Be with us during this hour of study and the next hour of worship. Watch over us, be with all your church family. Help us all to be good lights in the world we live in. Forgive us when we fail. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, going along with the lessons that Daniel has this class going through, it seems that we are in John chapter 9. So if you would turn there or scroll there, as the case may be. John chapter 9. If it helps, that's page 1101 in my Bible. And it seems like from the outline that he provided me that we read the whole chapter first. Do I read it, or do we have a couple individuals from it, or do I do it however I want to? All right. Let's maybe, because it's probably about 41 verses, do we have just one person read the whole thing, or maybe two people split it up in half? Two people? All right, let's have somebody read John chapter 1 down to about verse, trying to make sure that makes sense. Down to about verse 23. I volunteer to read John chapter 9, verses 1 through 23. And then somebody can finish up the chapter.
As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, and night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with his saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors of those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, he is like him." And he kept saying, "I am the man." And they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" And he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, anointed my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." And they said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, "I do not know." And they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." And some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He's a prophet." And the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received the sight and asked, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" And his parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age, he will speak for himself."
And then the rest of the chapter, please.
His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. This was why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you do not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciple too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple, we are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, but yet he opens my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a blind man before. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" and threw him out. Jesus heard they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You now have seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into the world, so the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you could see, your guilt remains."
All right. Sorry, that's John chapter 9. Starting off with the story that a lot of us are familiar with, but one that we can dig into anyways. And by the end of the chapter, Jesus is once again dropping a microphone on the Pharisees. So as he does. They kind of ask him to do it, though. They set him up, give him a nice big high pitch softball pitch that he can knock out of the park. But let's go ahead and dig into it. It seems like that in this class you've been looking at the nature of Jesus, specifically according to his message, how he portrays himself and stuff like that. So how does this chapter inform us more about Jesus and who he was?
Well, I'm reminded of when he healed the lame man and that he did it on the Sabbath, so he wasn't afraid to push back on the Jews.
Wasn't afraid to push back on the Jews. I would also say, as much as he obeyed the law, is he able to take advantage of certain situations and do a better good? And we can also get into the whole debate of what exactly is work. Was it work for Jesus to do it? I mean, his body healed people without him really even realizing it. Whenever the lady reaches out and touches his robe, she gets healed, not through any direct action of his. That's just part of his glory, is that it just kind of happens. What else can we learn? Does this support what you've been learning over the last couple weeks as far as Jesus' message? Is it confirmation?
Well, Jesus answered them that it was not his fault. He hadn't done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And because he wasn't blind because he did something wicked or his parents did something wicked. That was very much understood. Jesus made that plain. And so he was there to help them to see that this was the Son of God, because only the Son of God could do those things, and he felt it. And he did become a disciple. Is that not right?
He certainly gives some testimony here that is awfully strong. You know, some of the strongest testimony we see in the Gospels, and whether he gives it because he believes or whether he gives it because the Pharisees force him into it, trying to corner him, and he is very belligerent to their faces, and rightfully so. And it's interesting that you bring that up. I was going to kind of maybe say that later on, because in verse 34, sorry, they look at this man, and what do they conclude? That he was born blind. So he is steeped in sin at birth. Isn't that convenient for the non-invalid to label the invalid as being steeped in sin at birth? Isn't that a convenient excuse? And the Pharisees obviously were very much part of that teaching, to the point where even the disciples asked Jesus whenever they were traveling along to see a man born from, it was something that was very knee-jerk in their society. This was a teaching that was commonplace and probably put forth by the Pharisees, and probably also, historically speaking, a matter of keeping people under control. If you don't listen to us, your children may be born blind because you are steeped in sin, and so you need to follow what we're saying. I think it was very much a control measure there. So Jesus says no at the beginning of the chapter. They conclude at the end, obviously he was, to their understanding. But if you think about what you've been covering the last couple of weeks, especially chapter 7 and 8, there's a lot of discussions about who Jesus is. There's disputes over who Jesus is. Does this miracle confirm it? I would say yes. And as we are as humans, sometimes we focus in on the miracles, where Jesus uses this miracle to then have this man who was born blind go out in the society and say, this man must be the Son of God because look what he did for me. So the miracles support the message, as opposed to us. We would focus in on the miracles and, wow, look at all the things he's doing, where Jesus, it's the message that comes first. And this miracle confirms the conversations that's been surrounding Jesus the weeks prior.
You know, we're seeing prime examples here now that Jesus is in his ministry of the proper way to teach. And sometimes we have failed to do that. We've failed to teach properly.
Mm-hmm.
And he's showing us the best way to teach is to lay the situation out there, and what do you think? And then he concludes it, I am he. And a lot of times, if someone's living in sin, we jump right on them and say, you're living in sin, you need to repent, you need to change. Jesus didn't do that. He made them make their own decisions.
Yes. Yes, I'm kind of reminded back chapter 8, just kind of getting ready for this lesson, verse 32. Then you will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Who's burdened by, as we would call it, misinformation at the end of this chapter? And who is the free person who's walking around? the man who was born blind, and even his parents. And the Pharisees are still burdened down by this tradition that they have that they're beholden to. And they have to answer that tradition. Yes.
I'm not sure that this is always true, but I find it interesting that most of the time, he also asks you to do something, though. The man had to go to the pool and wash the mud off of his eyes. Jesus didn't just say, "You are healed."
Mm-hmm.
And when the woman who was bleeding, she had to reach his gown, robe. I don't remember enough of the miracles that if that's the case, well, maybe the making of the wine, they had to fill the jugs and bring them in. So I think he asked something of the people also, to show, well, not to show their faith because they didn't have the faith yet, but anyway, I find it interesting that that's part of it.
We're going to get to that here a little bit later on with this narrative, but I appreciate you looking to it. I would even say the lepers, he tells them, you have to go present yourself to the priest, so then you'll be accepted in society. Could Jesus have just proclaimed them right then that they were clean? But he holds to the protocols anyways. There is some activity that has to happen on our part, and that's what we're going to kind of dig into here in a second. Yes.
I think there's something interesting in the first couple of verses. He says, as he passed by, he, that's Jesus, saw a man blind from birth. Jesus is now, he's the Messiah, he's the leader of, at this point, there are thousands of people, hundreds of people following him around. And I've known people in ministry who were too big to notice the little person. I know of preachers who, for example, go to church Sunday morning and they sit in what's called a green room until time to speak, and then they come out and they speak. Then they go back in the green room. And I knew a preacher in another state who would come out and preach and then would go back and sit in his office. And he didn't associate with the little people. And if you spotted him, he would be up front talking to the elders and people in positions of power or people who were successful businessmen, but he didn't have any time to meet the stranger struggling at the door. And so I think it's significant that Jesus is walking through this crowd, and as significant as he is and as important as his ministry is, he sees a blind man.
Yeah, that's a very important point. It's amazing that Jesus had a peerless reputation because he didn't worry about his reputation. I mean, his disciples, half of them are probably illiterate. Don't know how to read or write. They know how to make a mark, which makes it even more powerful. And I was going to kind of bring up the point that they call him a rabbi. He's given that honorification as a rabbi, but he's not the typical rabbi at all. And so those that are rabbis really kind of bristled at the fact that he was called a rabbi, that he was given that honorific where, because rabbis do not go out and recruit their followers. They put a slate up on the street and you come and you ask them for their services. He doesn't, and he goes out and recruits them. And who does he recruit? A bunch of fishermen, a tax collector, a doctor, so to say, a zealot. So it's pretty amazing. One thing that I want to kind of dig into, though, just a little bit is they ask, was he born blind? We've kind of talked about that. What's Jesus' explanation? Why is this man blind? Anyone, go ahead.
That he might glorify God by having Jesus make him see again.
So looking forward to this time of this miracle. And he was born blind. We don't know how old this man was. He would have been of adult age. It's pretty amazing that some people criticize that the people of the society didn't recognize him. But where would they have seen this man on a daily basis? At the gate, sitting up against the wall, blind. Now all of a sudden you see him up walking around being able to see. Can you understand why they wouldn't necessarily recognize him? Are you comfortable with the fact that this man was born blind for this one instance? Because people outside of the church love to criticize wait, so God forced this man to be born blind so Jesus could perform this miracle. Why didn't he just have him be born with sight and Jesus could perform it differently? Why would we constrict this man's life up until that point? You know, and you've heard some of the criticisms, you know, about disease in the world. If God's such a loving God, why would he force Hosea to go out and marry a prostitute and buy her off the street multiple times? And how do we answer those criticisms? Here we have a man who was born blind, who had to live his life restricted, outcast, so Jesus could come along and obviously I'm asking it in a certain way so that I can present the argument, but how do we answer that argument?
Well, one person can lead many, and he was chosen to do that.
We read the story and we just accept it. But is this a cruelty on God's part to have a man born blind, to have these parents suffer with the fact that they have a child who's blind so that Jesus can be glorified? If Jesus is all-powerful, can he choose other ways for Jesus to be glorified? Go ahead.
Hey, John, I think we'd go back to the Garden of Eden when the devil tempted Eve and sin was introduced into the world. Sin has been in the world ever since that point, and bad things have happened ever since. If sin wasn't in the world, then bad things wouldn't happen, and it's not a direct result of any one person's sin that a child's hurt or someone gets deathly ill, or it's sin in the world. That's what brought the corruption into the world.
The belief of a fallen world, that things are nature kind of has a chance built into it, and everything's not going to be hunky-dory. Or else we would all be Job, and Satan would be able to come in and say, well, okay, yeah, you protected them. Of course they're faithful. So it does add to our faith just a little bit. I would also say this is Jesus' way of saying don't get caught up with the wrong issues. What does God ultimately want us to be? What is the one attribute of our lives that he's concerned about the most?
Faithfulness.
Faithfulness. And years ago, I was able to teach a class at a youth rally, and I made this point. If God wanted us to be happy, this Bible would be 2 words: be yourself. And we can determine how that self looks. And we have all the freedom in the world to do whatever makes us. He's not worried about us being happy. And what's ultimately crazy in my mind to sit there and think about it, if we become faithful, the happiness follows. We all know that worldly happiness is hollow. It's temporary. It's fleeting. It's not. I was actually watching an interview of, okay, so I'll make the reference, of the producer that did the Beastie Boys albums. So in case you don't know, it was 3 guys who were Jews. They were Jewish, and they became the biggest rap group in the late 80s, early 90s. And he's the producer, and he did this album that was absolutely just, revolutionary, stuff like that. And one of his friends called up and said, "Are you happy?" He goes, "No, actually, I'm not." He's like, it's crazy how many people are successful and rich, and they're unhappy because they realize I'm still yearning for something. I'm still looking for something. Was this man happy after this miracle was performed? Because he understood what the real honest truth was that Jesus is the Messiah, and if we follow in his footsteps, that's where happiness is found. And so don't get caught up with the issues that a lot of people want to look at. Too often I think we look at God from a worldly perspective, where God's looking at it from outside of that. And so this man, through this miracle, did he become faithful? It appears that he did, maybe even his parents. And other people were able to see the corruption that was in the Pharisees and realize that Jesus is the one that they should be following. So a couple points I just want to make sure I cover what Daniel has here. With Jesus is the light of the world who grants sight. So we kind of covered some of that. The miracle confirms Jesus' claim. The miracle shows Jesus is the light of the world who helps us to see, not only physically, but also spiritually. This man and his parents come across some spiritual truths in the middle of this chapter. Miracle always confirmed Jesus offered living water. The pool of Siloam was a pool which water was drawn for ceremony during the Feast of Booths. And so the pool of Siloam was very famous, was a place where ceremonial, and at least once a year they would go and visit the pool of Siloam. So it was very much known. What is so significant as we follow this man along? The people of the society don't recognize him. He says he made mud in the dirt. And maybe Dave knows a little bit more about this verse than what I do. Not to gross anybody out, I can't spit in the dirt enough to make mud. Now maybe he found a put like a kind of a puddle of mud already and just added his saliva to it. But I think sometimes we skip over that verse as well. Yeah, he spit in the dirt, he made some mud. What? Really? Because how much water is that? How much saliva is that to make a pool of mud? Now maybe the mud already existed. He just kind of, like I said, added his saliva to it. So then part of his, which is kind of a nasty thing to think about, anyways. But I'm amazed that whenever this man finally shows up in front of the Pharisees, and they ask him how he did it. The man was blind. He had to be told how Jesus did it. He's blind, think about it, he can't see, and all of a sudden these hands are on his face, and this, I'm assuming, a cool substance covers his eyes, and Jesus tells him, your eyes are not covered with mud, go find this pool, which he had to be led to, and wash the mud off, and then you can see. And the Pharisees are like, well, how'd he did it? How's this guy supposed to know? He was blind. So obviously the witnesses told him where he was, but whenever he first starts off, what is his first answer when the Pharisees say, who do you think this was? Other people said he was a prophet. So does the man at this point, with the first interview from the Pharisees, does he really know who Jesus is? Does he really know who healed him? If you think back in your life, how often does that happen? You receive assistance, you receive strength, and you don't even recognize his touch. Not saying ignorance on our part, just how wonderful and a marvelous God he is, that he can definitely come in and so subtly affect our lives, and all of a sudden 6 months later you look back and you realize, wow, that was providence. That was God working in my life, and I didn't even recognize it at the time. Yes.
In essence, it's the providence of God that's always working for us.
Maybe I'm going to ask you to clarify that, because you made a difference between love and providence. Maybe clarify that just a little bit.
I guess what I was saying, the man didn't know who caused him to be able to see, and so I said, we know it was a miracle, but a lot of times things happen to us, and we think that we're lucky, and when in essence it's the providence of God that's always working for us.
All right. It always amazes me whenever, and obviously God blesses in a lot of different ways, and sometimes it is financially. Something happens, your brakes goes out in your car or something like that, and all of a sudden this random check shows up in the mail from something that you did 9 months ago. And you realize, and granted, it seems like sometimes talking about financially seems to be a little bit shallow, but God takes care of us in a lot of different ways. The birds of the air are dressed the way that they are. And all of a sudden you realize God worked on this thing and provided the solution 9 months, and it had to work through all these different channels for this check to be written, for it to make it in the mail, to make it in my mailbox. He just didn't start this 2 days ago. This was a result of something that's been in the works, and he knew I needed it right then to relieve me of this burden, of this worry and stuff like that. It's pretty amazing how sometimes the providence of God is something that God foresaw months ago, and I wasn't even aware the situation was going to happen. Mm-hmm. Yes, or else, yeah, just somebody kind of randomly shows up and just maybe sends you, gives you a phone call or a random text. Hey, I've been thinking about you the last couple weeks. Yes, we are definitely meant to be in this thing together. Now, as we get introduced the man to the synagogue, or to the Pharisees, obviously we have one group of people. The man has physically been restored his sight, but he gains spiritual sight, does he not? And who ignores that spiritual sight? Who chooses to remain ignorant? The Pharisees do. So, looking forward to that, what exactly did it mean to be thrown out of the synagogue? And underneath it here, he says, this is group work. So I understand that he kind of has you discuss in little groups and stuff like that. So we'll give you a few minutes. He actually has two questions down here, but I think we kind of covered one already. What do we learn from the man who was healed about to have spiritual sight? And what do we learn from the Jewish leaders, how to remain spiritually blind? And what does it mean to be thrown out of the synagogue? So we'll give you a few minutes to kind of discuss that, and then we will come back together. So that is your group work, so to speak. So maybe discuss with the people around you just a little bit. Have a chance to maybe wake up a little bit. What does Jesus' statement about the man's blindness not being a result of sin suggest how we view the struggles of others? Was one. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong questions. What do we learn from the man who was healed about how to have spiritual sight? And what do we learn from the Jewish leaders how to remain spiritually blind? And then also, what does it mean to be thrown out of the synagogue? About 30 more seconds, please. Ten more seconds. All right, would any group like to share what you discussed? Some point maybe we haven't discussed yet. Because there's an awful lot here. Right over here.
To be thrown out of the synagogue, they'd be ostracized in their community, almost like a leper, in a way they would not be able to, even socially, in their community.
I think, yeah, that goes along with, what was the point that you discussed over here, would be, oh, wow, interception, go ahead.
Did you like that?
I did.
All around us, nature gives us a way to put God in perspective. And sometimes we take advantage of that, thinking that God has blessed us with a circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus, when he did his ministry, he did an example of walking along the path, and he saw a tree there, and he smote the tree.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that wouldn't have meant anything except for the fact that he was using that as a teaching tool. And every time, and he's using this blind man as a tool. And I'm sure there are other blind people within the community that didn't enjoy the same thing, but that was his tool of nature.
Okay.
And we have to recognize that. And I was telling Donna, we received some checks from our property taxes. There's some lawsuit, group action lawsuit. It's just one of those things that happens.
Mhm.
And I don't think God was at the tax department saying, you give this to Donna. And then we turn around and praise God because he blessed us with those checks. He used specific things to promote his agenda,
Okay.
like the blind man. He
Yes.
used him.
Yes. So, yes, it all does come back to every action that he did supported the message. And kind of like what I said before, we would have it flipped. We would be all about the show. And the message, maybe they hand out the pamphlet after the show and we just throw it in the first garbage can we come by. It would be all about the show. I think I heard over here, to be thrown out of the synagogue, wouldn't you almost be a Gentile at that point? You would be treated like the Gentiles. And as we read here, what are the parents worried about? What action could they perform that they were worried about being thrown out of the synagogue? Were they working on the Sabbath? What action would it cause the parents to be thrown out of the synagogue? Is that what you were going to say back there? To say that Jesus was the Son of God, that Jesus was the Son.
Confessing Jesus.
So, a disagreement, is that what it comes down to? If you disagree with the Pharisees, you get thrown out of the synagogue and ostracized from your people? Is that the reason to drop the hammer on somebody? According to the Pharisees, it was. Because once again, it was all about control for them. I could go into a couple examples there because I teach history, but just kind of looking at the time there. So the parents are very coy with their answers in front of the Pharisees. They kind of give an answer like, well, you've seen him. He was blind and now he can see. You tell us what do you think happened? So they're very coy with their answers because they don't want to disagree with the Pharisees because they're afraid of being thrown out of the synagogue. Does the young man, I'm assuming young, probably shouldn't say that, middle-aged man, we don't know how old he was, does he disagree with them? At first, he kind of placates them a little bit, gives them, well, I was blind, this man put mud in my eyes, I went and washed in the pool, and now I can see. And then the second time, he actually says, in verse 27, do you want to become his disciples too? Which I think is a pretty valuable question, but obviously he knows that they don't. But he's kind of like, he's already exasperated. Why do you keep dragging me in front of it? You see that I can see now. You know that I couldn't. And yet you're asking me to answer a question I can't answer. When the answer is standing in front of you, I am the answer. Then eventually he says, you don't know where he comes from, yet he opened up my eyes. When he says, we know that God does not listen to sinners, was that something that he was aware of, or was that something the Pharisees had taught him? Would the Pharisees be saying that God does not listen to sinners? So he uses their own teaching against them. We know, because you've told us, that God does not listen to sinners when we know that he does, Cornelius. But that was a Pharisaical teaching, and he uses it right up against them. And here is this man that was a result of a miracle. And what's the end result? They throw him out of the synagogue. This man who now can see, and they want to maintain their spiritual blindness so much that they're willing to ignore this great and awesome gift that Jesus has given this man and his family. And they're so steeped in their teaching that they ignore it. And so without getting into all the points, the man absolutely, and the parents, I would also say, gained their spiritual sight, and the Pharisees cling to their blindness, which Jesus talks about later on in the passage. Yes.
It's interesting to see how illogical the Pharisees have become in order to support their chosen views and opinions. On the one hand, they look at a man born blind and they say, you're a sinner because you're born blind.
Mm-hmm.
Then they see a man heal someone and they say, you're a sinner because you healed somebody.
Yeah.
If blindness is evidence that you're a sinner, then wouldn't the power to heal be, which it isn't, by the way, but in their thinking, wouldn't the power to heal automatically be a sign you're from God?
You would think so, because they would be very familiar with all of the Old Testament stories. And even somebody that can make an axe head float in the lake, they would honor that person. But somebody that can cure blindness? Yes.
They made a point in verse 28 that we know God, or you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. And we understand that God talked to Moses, but they're still followers of Moses, which Jesus is replacing, and they don't get it.
I think it's ironic, because I looked at that before, and I didn't know if I was going to be able to dig into it. In verse 28, we're disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. Where did Moses come from? Did any of the Israelites know where Moses came from? Would they have honored Jesus if he was raised in Herod's house? And yet Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house. If Jesus was a stepson of Herod, would they have accepted him? No. So once again, their duality is just unbelievable. I'm going to let Daniel know, just because we owe 10:15, correct? So I want to make sure. I'm going to let him know that we're going to hold off right before Jesus finally goes and talks to the man, but I think I'll predict his lesson by asking this one question. You can simmer on it until next week. Why doesn't Jesus come to the man's aid? Why does he wait until after the third confrontation with the Pharisees for Jesus to seek this man out? He waits until he's thrown out of the synagogue. Why doesn't he aid him whenever he's drugged before the Pharisees 1, 2, and the third time? Think about that. Let it simmer. I appreciate our time this morning. It was an awesome time. I was glad that I was freed up. In case you don't know, Jesse is doing this little service project, so he's actually taking the teen and youth adult class. That freed me up to be able to handle this class for Daniel. So appreciate it. Go ahead, and you are free until 10:30-ish. Thank you all very, very much.